Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight's going to be a long one. We're going to get through three short chapters, and we'll be reading The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Subletti. Our first chapter is chapter 39, and it starts with an excerpt from a letter from Sumterville, South Carolina purchasing agent A.J. McClevin to Charleston dealer Ziba B. Oaks, dated November 7th, 1853, who said, "A little boy has one of his toes cut off. I don't think that will lessen his value. Dr. Ingram has known the boy for a length of time and says he never gives him medicine, but once for a bellyache. He is smaller than I'd like, but it is hard to buy at any price up here." In his will, Isaac Franklin directed that the income from his plantations support a school to be named the Isaac Franklin Institute. But his wife, Adelcia, got the court to void the provision on the grounds that it would create a perpetuity, which in this case would have rested upon the perpetual reproduction of the estates enslaved. Instead, she got the assets, including Fairview. The trustees' management of Franklin's estate terminated with the resolution of the widow's court proceeding. During the 5 years or so of their management, seemingly every single receipt submitted for every expense was collected and printed as part of the 918-page legal document titled Succession of Isaac Franklin, which thus provides an unusually detailed snapshot of the mercantile realities of the time. The trustees bought laudanum, morphine, calomel, which is mercury chloride, a toxic compound then believed to have medicinal value and often used as a laxative, and a host of other preparations for when the Negroes were sick. They bought Negro shoes from the Tennessee State Prison, which used convict labor to make saleable products. They sold cotton and lumber. Adelicia was presented to Queen Victoria when she visited London and was complimented on her riding skills by the horsewoman Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg. It was Adelicia who brought Spanish Palminos to breed in Tennessee. With her new husband, Jacob Acklin, she became a leading light of the Nashville social scene at her new 36-room mansion on the estate called Belmont, which besides 10,000 square feet of living space, had a bear house and a zoo, and was where her daughter Emma died of diphtheria. John Armfield, too, became a respectable planter and was a principal benefactor of the founding of the University of South at Centerville, Tennessee. Franklin's former Richmond partner, Rice C. Ballard, became a planter as well, though he continued to be in the slave trade. He married and moved to Louisville, though it seems he had spent a great deal of time in Natchez, to judge from the letters he received from his wife there, begging him for money. Ballard became friends and then a business partner with a Natchez judge named Samuel S. Boyd, with whom he co-owned a string of cotton plantations worked by perhaps 500 slaves in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Boyd and Ballard's man in New Orleans was a Louisville-based slave trader named C.M. Rutherford, whose office in New Orleans was at 159 Gravier Street, between Barron and Carolande, and who also sold slaves in Natchez. It was advantageous for Ballard to keep a hand in the slave retailing business. He and Boyd at one point closed down a plantation and sold the entire labor force south, a few at a time, family by family. Ballard provided working cash for Rutherford to buy with, and Rutherford knew what Ballard liked, as he offered him a woman, 19 years old, black likely, and as right as tall and as likely as the one you wanted of white, price 700. Notice that they had that description of likely white because she was probably a fancy girl and she probably had some white features. She was probably dainty, but she had red hair and was freckled. Boyd was cruel to women. The Natchez attorney, J.M. Duffield, had owned a woman named Maria, and though he was fond of her and had a sexual relationship with her, he wound up, through financial pressures, losing her to Boyd's ownership. On May 29th, 1848, Duffield wrote to Ballard about Maria and her daughter, who may have been his own daughter, asking him to intervene after she had been whipped like an ox until the blood gushed from her. In another letter from Duffield, reported on August 5th, that Mr. Boyd will part with her now as her health is such that she must be a charge on any owner, as she suffered from womb complaint dreadfully brought on by the unkindness and injuries, bodily injuries, and now that she can leave Boyd, she can now recover, though she will probably linger out to several years. Unfortunately, Duffield didn't have any cash right then. He offered another slave as security, promising to pay any price you might think she ought to bring, and perhaps prolong her life, which soon will be shortened where she is now. On February 27th, 1853, Rutherford wrote to Ballard from New Orleans about a troublesome slave named Virginia, which may have been the name her mother gave her or may have simply been where she was purchased. Virginia was being sent as far away as Rutherford could manage, along with her swelling baby and her two children, who, though he didn't need to mention it, they looked like Judge Boyd. While Rutherford was trying to decide whether to send her to Texas or to Mobile, Alabama, she kept trying to run away. Meanwhile, it was good to know a judge on April 2nd, 1853, Boyd, came into Ballard with a dirty deal: the lucrative prospect of selling the whole plantation full of freed Black slaves back into slavery. He said, "How lately I have learned of an opportunity to buy a lot of Negroes at a very reasonable rate next January. Old man Baldwin of Jefferson County directed that his slaves were to be sent to Liberia. This will be declared void at the present term of the High Court. And as nearly all the heirs reside in New Jersey, they do not want the slaves and are willing that they should be sold all together to a good master at a reasonable rate according to the will if it cannot be carried out." The name here was indecipherable. One of the executors, we assume, has informed me that he thinks they can be had at $27,000 for 52 slaves. He is to furnish me with a list soon and will endeavor to obtain authority to close the trade. So, as you can see, Even though these people were supposed to be freed and sent to Liberia per the will, they only upheld wills for as long as the will of the deceased was to the benefit of the living. That same day, Rutherford wrote to Ballard that he had decided to send Virginia to Texas, but it was going to cost. He had a friend there that he can send her to, but the vessels will not take any Negro unless under the charge of some white person. So eager were the partners to get rid of Virginia that Rutherford hired an escort to deliver her personally to Texas. From New Orleans, Rutherford handled her case to the point of final sale, offering easy terms, as Rutherford reported on April 19th, saying of Virginia, I have this morning shipped Virginia and her children to S.B. Ewing, Houston, Texas, with special instructions to sell her, not to return to this place or Mississippi. I gave her character and did not limit the sale when I sold to permit accounts and sales and net proceeds and other factors. Nally Cox and Company of this place for your benefit. I will give Nally Cox and Company a copy of my letter of instructions. I had to hire a young man to go with her to Galveston. So not only was she seeking her freedom for herself and her children, she was probably a fighter. A letter from Boyd 3 days later refers to Virginia only as the woman, makes it clear that she didn't go quietly. Rutherford was to ship the woman and her children to Texas on Tuesday last by the steamer Mexico. She gave him a load of trouble. There exists a letter from a heavily pregnant Virginia to Ballard, written in the desperation of the moment. The dimensions of her sorrow are apparent, even though much is unknowable about the events referred to. A facsimile is available online. We will present it here as we have transcribed it, adding full stop, periods, capital letters, and paragraphing for better readability, with question marks indicating transcription queries, brackets around reasonable guesses, and X's signifying missing bits of text. And the letter from Virginia, the heavily impregnated slave woman, reads, Houston, May 6th, 1853. Dear Sir, permit me to address you with a few lines which I hope you will receive soon. I am at present in the city of Houston in a Negro trader's yard for sale by your orders. I was present at the post office when Dr. Ewing took your letter out through mistake and read it out loud, not knowing I was the person alluded to. So she was an educated Black woman. I hope that if I ever have done or said anything that offended you, that you will forgive me for that, for I have suffered enough since my mind to repay all that I have ever done to anyone. You wrote for them to sell me in 30 days. Do you think after all that has transpired and between me and the old man, I don't call names, that is treating me well to send me off among strangers in my situation to be sold without my even having the opportunity to choose for myself? It is hard indeed. And what is still harder, for the father of my children to sell his own offspring, yes, his own flesh and blood. My God, is it possible that any freeborn American would brand his charities with such a stigma as that? But I hope before this he will relent and see his error, for I still believe that he possesses of more honor than that. I know too that you have influence and can assist me in some measure from out of this dilemma. And if you will, God will be sure to reward you. You have a family of children and know how to sympathize with others in distress. All I require or ask is for an agent to be appointed to hear me, to see me, to earn the money honestly, to buy me. I have to work my finger ends off. I will earn every dime. I do think in justice the children should be set free. As for myself, although my youthful days were worn out in the service and gratification of the person that wants me and his children sold, it is possible that such a change could ever come over the spirit of any living man as to sell his child that is in his own image. I do not wish to return to harass or molest his peace of mind, and shall never try to get back if I am still with family. I know that you have been prejudiced against me by what, name was unclear, told you. One day you will find who is the rascal and who has injured you most. I have no motive in saying to you anything but the pure truth when you come to know all that she has said to relative to you and matters concerning your family. You will perhaps not have so great a confidence in all the tales she fabricates. I wish you to reflect over the subject and see if some little could be shown for the mercy and pity you show me, God certainly will show you. What can I say more? If I ever have spoken hastily that which I should not hope, you will forgive me, for I hope God has. I am humbled enough and ready to hear among strangers without one living being to whom I have the least shadow of claim upon. My heart feels like it would burst asunder. It will not be long here. I am confined, and the author of my sufferings to be the means of my being thrown upon charity of strangers in the place where she was, when I am in most need of sympathizing with a friend. Is this person and that person to receive for making so much for the satisfaction of the judge? Will you let me hear from you and say that your feelings are relative to the proposition I make? I know that you are an honorable, high minded man, and in your moments, your intimate moments, you would wish justice to be done to all. And if I am a servant, there is something due me better than my present situation. I have written to the old man in such a way that the letter can't fail to fall into his hands and none other. I use any precaution to prevent others from knowing or suspecting anything. I have my letters written and folded, put into an envelope, and get it directed by those that don't know the contents of it, for I shall not seek ever to let anything be exposed unless I am forced to from bad treatment. Yours sincerely, Virginia Boyd. Again, she was an enslaved woman who was heavily pregnant with the judge's children. Some of the allusions of Virginia Boyd's letter are accidental, some strategic. We can imagine the story. Indeed, we have in order to pause as we read it. But there's much more we don't know. Who was the old man, really? The father of her children that she's referring to? Presumably, it's Judge Boyd. She signed Boyd's name as hers with the clear indication that her children are to carry that name too. But Ballard was the one giving the sale order, apparently because Virginia was owned by the partnership and Ballard handled slave sales. Unlike Maria, Virginia at least got away from Boyd without being maimed. All three of the traders in the loop knew her. She indicates a personal familiarity with Ballard, who was a frequent visitor to Natchez and to her co-owner, and who she believes has been turned against her by lies told to him by another enslaved female. We can make up stories about what that was about, but we just don't know. What else we might know about Virginia? According to Rutherford's earlier letter, she already had two children. She felt that her youthful days were behind her. She might have been 25, ready to be discarded as old. What did she look like? She had been the mistress of the slave trader, so she was presumably light skinned. She wasn't a field hand. She had been accustomed to privileges and perhaps had imagined the goal of freedom for herself and her children to be getting closer. She expected to be able to choose for herself, suggesting perhaps that even in her enslaved status, she had to question at some point, but that she had been humbled. The level of literacy in her letter is at least as good as the traders. There is no reason to assume that it was written by a scribe. Well, there is a reason to presume that it was written by a scribe because at the end she said that she writes the letters, she has them written and folded up and sealed, right? But the author here missed that fact. It twists and turns, seems to be the product of a coordinated mind, voice, and hand. Somehow we don't know how she had the ability to get letters sent by private channels out of the private trader's yard, one to Boyd apparently, and one to this Ballard. And she warns if she is forced from bad treatment, she could write another one that would tell what somebody doesn't want known. The blackmail threat did her no good. She was sold into the hard conditions of the Texas frontier. There's no known record of her further existence. Her plea to free her children was ignored. Slave traders didn't set children free, they sold them, and they were inured to. Perhaps they even enjoyed it. Perhaps they heard desperate pleas that made their ears tingle. Virginia was sold together with her younger child, whose gender we do not know, for $1,000. If that child was Boyd's daughter, by light skinned Virginia, she would have been nearly white, a fancy girl, the slave trader's premium prize. And in a typical slave trader move, Virginia's older child, a girl, was kept back. A letter of August 8th from Rutherford to Ballard said, I received a letter this morning informing me of the sale of Virginia and her child, reserving the eldest child for $1,000. I wrote Mr. Ewing not to sell the oldest child until he had heard from me. I recollect you wanted to reserve her before she went away which can be done now. If you wish, let me hear from you on the subject. 5 months after Virginia was disposed of, Rutherford wrote Ballard from Natchez. Since writing, I have seen Judge Boyd. He tells me that he thinks you will want 10 to 15 more females. I have on hand, I think, 12 more, but they are the kind you would not buy. I know they are such as I would not buy for you, although they are large. You cannot buy anything like a fair woman here for less than $1,000. Any that you would have. I know a lot of Georgia Negroes at Memphis that I think you could buy the women for 900. I told the judge, if you wished me, I would go up there and buy you 10 or 15 and charge you nothing but my expenses. The judge is in favor of my going if you say so. It may be fair that Isaac Franklin's fantasy of a company whorehouse was not such an exaggeration. In 1856, the year the secessionist leader and former governor James Henry Hammond was elected senator from South Carolina, he wrote his 22-year-old son Harry a remarkably candid letter regarding the disposition of two sex slaves in the latest version of his will. Hammond did something of an outlier in sexual behavior, as his confessionary diary reveals. He wrote some of the only antebellum letters that survive documenting a sexual relationship between two men with Thomas Jefferson Withers, and confessed in his diary to molesting all four of his teenage nieces from the marriage of Wade Hampton II to his wife's sister. Hammond had purchased Sally Johnson, who was a mulatto seamstress when she was 18, along with her presumably lighter skinned 1-year-old daughter, Louisa, who became his concubine when she was 12. So he groomed her basically from infancy up until the age of 12 to please him. And he was proud of it because he put it in his diary and documented it. He had children by both women, mother and daughter, which is to say, besides those children's complicated relationships to each other, they were his son's half sibling, as he explained in this letter to his son, saying, in the last will I made, I left to you over and above my other children, Sally Johnson, the mother of Louisa, and all of the children of both. Sally says Henderson is my child. It is possible, but I do not believe it. Yet act on hers rather than on my opinion. Louisa's first child may be mine. I think not. Her second, I believe, is mine. Take care of her and her children, who are both your blood, if not of mine, and of Henderson. The services of the rest, I will think, compensate for an indulgence to these. I cannot free these people and send them north. That would be cruelty to them. Nor would I like that any but my own blood should have and own slaves of my blood or Louisa. I leave them to your charge, believing that you will best appreciate and most independently carry out my wishes in regard to them. Do not let Louisa or any of my children or possible children be slaves of strangers. Slavery in the family will be their happiest earthly condition. Among the greatest misfortunes Hammond considered himself to have suffered was that his captives died so frequently. He said, I have lost 89 Negroes and at least 50 mules and horses in 11 years. He lamented this in his diary. Perhaps he wrote he should move their quarters to a less unhealthy spot. So, as you can see in these letters that he was writing, he was confessing his sins. He was confessing of these illicit relationships that he was having with these women, increasing his finances, wanting to keep them to be slaves for the family. So, in his mind's eye, he was just reproducing slaves to help serve his family. How perverted, sick, and twisted is that? And how perverted, sick, and twisted is that he had intimate relations with the mother who was 18 and the daughter starting at the age of 12. He is a sick, sick man. Chapter 40, Communists in Blackface, starts with a quote from South Carolina resident Edward Bryan in 1850. He said, give us slavery or give us death. The discovery of gold in California was a turning point on the way to Southern secession. President Polk announced the find to the nation in his near year-end message of 1848. Some 90,000 gold seekers arrived in Northern California in 1849, staking their claims and displacing and unaliving Native Americans en masse. The native population of the region dwindled in short order from about 150,000 down to 30,000. Lured by the boom, immigrants came from Latin America and Europe to California and to the United States in general. And on top of this, the massive Irish potato famine migration that began arriving in numbers in 1847, Asian trade developed, Hawaii's economy thrived, and Chinese workers, principally Cantonese, came to both Hawaii and California. As gold fever spread, men who were perhaps as much as 95% of the early migrant population left home and family to go west. Nantucket found itself drained of 1/4 of its voting population in 9 months. As a song from the period describes the mania, it said, the people all went crazy then. They didn't know what to do. They sold their farms for just enough to pay their passage through. They bid their friends a long farewell and said, dear wife, don't cry. I'll send you home with yellow lumps, a piano for you to buy. They're talking about being able to send gold back home so that they can buy a piano, which was an expensive household accessory then, just as much as it is now. With the discovery of other mines in the West, billions of dollars worth of new money was extracted over the ensuing decades. It was an immediate game changer with global implications. So much gold was sucked into Britain that the United States creditor and the world's economic powerhouse that it was easily able to consolidate its already in progress shift to the gold standard. Europe was troubled by a wave of revolutions. beginning with a revolt in Sicily in January 1848 and a much bigger one in France the following month. Insurrection spread to most of the continent because they think Europe is a continent. But it was put down within a year, and economic problems faded away as the new money supply worked its way into the continent. A mint was established in San Francisco as the United States issued unprecedented amounts of its own gold coinage. In the year 1848, when the mines were found, they had minted $3,775,000 worth of gold. In 1850, just 2 years later, they minted $31,981,000 worth of gold. In 1851, they more than doubled that by minting $62,614,000 worth of gold. And in 1852, it started to dry up, but not by much. They minted $56,846 in gold. The flood of coins brought down the price of gold and drove silver out of circulation. With a domestic supply of gold, the United States could at last ban foreign money, most especially the Spanish dollar, from circulation in 1857. The total amount of paper money issued by banks in circulation and on deposit went from 231 million in 1848 to 392 million in 1854 and 445 million in 1857. So this country has a long history of just printing money when it thinks it has a valuable resource. And the paper was of higher quality for having so much more gold in the system. Bankers and businessmen had a newfound sense of confidence and optimism, which made them more eager to speculate. The British were also investing. California was an immigration magnet, but it was as hard to get to San Francisco from New York as it was to get from Chile, and Chilean gold seekers were indeed arriving. The eastern U.S. wanted a transcontinental railroad, and the United States government wanted the Central American portage crossing. Whether in Honduras, Nicaragua, or the ultimate choice, Panama, the latter of which was then part of Colombia, but would be pried away to become a zone of U.S. influence. It was the richest injection of precious metal into the global economy since the Habsburgs had capitalized the world with gold and silver from Mexico and Peru. As the dimensions of the gold find became clear in 1849, the statehood of California was suddenly an urgent matter. Before some other country tried to move in, or before miners decided to declare themselves an independent republic. Unlike Louisiana, which had been slave territory before Washington took it over, California had been free territory under Mexico, and even slave-owning President Zachary Taylor was against establishing slavery there. But there was a powerful economic interest in favor of it. Slavery in California would, it was widely believed, make the value of existing slave ownings appreciate sharply. So they thought that they could integrate California as a slave state into the nation and that would make everybody rich. A few slave owners moved with their slaves to Southern California, hoping to establish it as a slave territory and take over the government, as it happened in Texas. But moving a plantation worth of captive laborers even a few hundred miles was a big undertaking, let alone the near impossibility of taking coffles the 1,400 parched miles from Houston to Los Angeles. Southerners saw gold mining as something that should be done by slave labor purchased from them. But up north, the 49er gold miners, who drafted their own legal codes requiring small, continuously worked claims, weren't about to have slaves working on massive gold plantations. They didn't want slave labor or even free Black people for them. California was white man's country. When a group of Texans headed by Thomas Jefferson Green tried establishing claims on the Yuba River in the names of their 16 slaves in July of 1849, miners informed them that no slave or Negro should own claims or even work in the mines, and they physically expelled them all. The large state of California, extending all the way down to San Diego, requested annexation with a free soil constitution in 1849, putting checkmate as they did so on the westward expansion of slavery. One delegate at the California Constitutional Convention, named Henry Tefft, matter-of-factly referred to the slave owners as capitalists when he warned the assembly that the young white male miner population would be unable, even if willing, to compete with the bands of Negroes who would be set to work under the direction of the capitalists. It would become a monopoly of the worst character. The profits of the mines would go into the pockets of single individuals, a clause that would have barred free Blacks from entering the territory was voted down. In South Carolina, Robert Barnwell Rhett, outraged that a group of gold-digging migrants could declare themselves to define California and thus exclude slavery, derided the California Constitution as squatter sovereignty. Squatter being the preferred aristocratic epithet for poor rural whites who often lacked the legal title to the land that they lived on. The states were the owners of the territories, argued the fire eaters, and the slave states must be allowed to bring their property to their territory. Henry Clay, together with Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, attempted to placate the slave power with a grand compromise in January of 1850 that was packaged by Mississippi Unionist Henry Foote into a single omnibus bill, which was then disassembled and recast into a series of laws known as the Compromise of 1850. It proposed admitting California as a free state and giving territorial status to Utah, later to be divided into Utah and Nevada, and New Mexico, which was later to be divided into New Mexico and Arizona, while disregarding Texas's claims to New Mexican territory. In Clay's final grand speech, after decades of fame as an orator, he attacked Massachusetts Senator John Davis's charge that Texans were trying to establish the breeding of slaves in New Mexico, a territory that was useless for plantation agriculture, but which Texas had intent on annexing as slave territory. Davis, perhaps intimidated, denied having used the term, but Clay wouldn't let him off the hook. He rhapsodied about how kind slave owners were to their slaves and how sale into the market only was a painful last resort. Then he demonized abolitionists. He thus discredited himself in the eyes of posterity as a pandering apologist for slavery. Remember, Henry Clay was no friend to the Black man. While failing to please the fire eaters, who wanted much more than Clay was prepared to give, Clay was a Unionist, and for him, the Union of the United States meant the compromises that only he was adroit enough to manage. So he was not an abolitionist in the way that we want to lionize and make him a hero. Henry Clay was a Unionist, like Lincoln was a Unionist. So these men did not necessarily agree with, nor were they for slavery. They were not for or against slavery. They were simply for the Union and whatever steps needed to be taken in order to preserve the Union, which was this fragile, burgeoning, expansionist nation called the United States of America. Whatever sacrifices needed to be had to make that happen, he was willing to negotiate. The Compromise of 1850, when we're talking about California, included the prohibition of the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Since Alexandria had left the district and returned to Virginia precisely over this issue, the interstate trade was not seriously disrupted. And in any case, slavery was not abolished in the district. But the secessionist project that was already well underway considered compromise to be treason, and the fire eaters screamed bloody murder anyway. For the North, the most offensive compromise was the new Fugitive Slave Act, aimed at shutting down the Underground Railroad that emboldened the enslaved to escape. The building on the constitutional requirement to hand over fugitive persons held to service. It required lawmen to capture and deliver anyone in any state accused of being a fugitive slave, with no right of denial on the part of the accused. In other words, it gave kidnappers a legal apparatus. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like something that's happening to this very day, where they are looking at people, making a decision about their status, and then sending them somewhere else? Now, immigration is not our issue, our main issue at this point in time, because we have a different fight here. But the reality is that this ICE thing ain't nothing new. They always use the apparatuses of the legal system to cleanse an area. That's what they do. Outraged by the aggression of ending the slave trade in the District of Columbia, Southern members of both houses of Congress met in a caucus and produced the address of the Southern delegates of Congress to their constituents. Mostly written by the aged and embittered John C. Calhoun, It warned of emancipation's awful consequences, expanding out into rings of ever more apocalyptic fantasy clad in the robes of prophecy. We offer here one of its key passages as a glimpse into the routinely voiced Southern fear that white people would be on the receiving end of the violence of slavery. John Calhoun wrote, "If emancipation should ever be affected, it would be through the agency of the federal government. Controlled by the dominant power of the northern states of the Confederacy against the resistance and struggle of the Southern. It can only be affected by the prostration of the white race, and that would necessarily engender the bitterest feelings of hostility between them and the North. But the reverse would be the case between the Blacks of the South and the people of the North. Owing their emancipation to them, they would regard them as friends, guardians, and patrons, and center accordingly all of their sympathy in them. The people of the North would not fail to reciprocate and to favor them instead of whites. Under the influence of such feelings and impelled by fanaticism and love of power, they would not stop at emancipation." So, as you can see, he was hyperbolic in his language, and he was saying that if they got emancipated, they would turn to violence because they would want retribution for the things that they did. So, they've always known that slavery and the way that they treated their enslaved populations were wrong. They've known that we were human, and they've known that they made the decision to treat human beings in this unnatural way. So the reality of the situation is that they were afraid, and they are still afraid, that if we come to power, we will do to them what they have done to us. That is why they want you asleep. That is why they want you ignorant of your history. That is why they are forcing this down your throat to purge American history of Black history so that people don't know, so that you can walk around willfully ignorant and in bliss dealing with these people because you don't know what they're capable of. Because although you may remember it epigenetically, that's that feeling, that's something that you get. You don't know, and you won't have the proof or the books to prove your point of view and perspective. Another step would be taken to raise them to political and social equality with their former owners by giving them the right of voting and holding public offices under the federal government. We see the first step toward it in the bill already alluded to vest the free Blacks and slaves with the right to vote on the question of emancipation in this district. But when once raised to an equality, they would become the fast political associates of the North, acting and voting with them on all questions. And by this political union between them, holding the white race at the South in complete subjection, the Blacks and the prolific whites might unite with them, would be the principal recipients of federal offices and patronage. It's about resources. And would, in consequence, be raised above the whites of the South in the political and social scale. We would, in a word, change conditions with them. A degradation greater than that has yet fallen to the lot of free and enlightened people, and one from which we would not escape should emancipation take place, which it certainly will if not prevented. But by fleeing the homes of ourselves and ancestors, and by abandoning our country to our former slaves to become the permanent abode of disorder, anarchy, poverty, misery, and wretchedness. So he was totally terrified that white people, especially Southern white people, would become the bottom, would become the lowest class citizen. Mississippi was a rich state during our enslavement. And afterwards, it hasn't been able to rebound yet because they haven't found anything that can enrich them like slaves can. Frederick Douglass answered Calhoun's negrophobic blast, referencing the Fugitive Slave Act by saying, "We say to the slaveholder, insist upon your right to make northern men your bloodhounds, to hunt down your slaves and return them to bondage. We say, let this be insisted upon the more strenuously the better, as it will sooner awaken the North to a sense of their responsibility for slavery, not only to the District of Columbia and in forts, arsenals, and navy yards, but in the states themselves, and will the sooner see their duty to labor for the removal of slavery from every part of this most unhallowed nation. In any case, naught but slaveholders have anything to fear." John Calhoun died of tuberculosis in March of 1850, with treason in his heart and on his lips, in the words of his Senate adversary, Thomas Hart Benton, who, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, was by that time largely a spent force. When Calhoun began fomenting pro slavery disunion, he was the only such figure on the national stage. His followers competed to be the most radical. And in his final years, Calhoun pushed aside Robert Barnwell Rhett, his longtime lieutenant, and had visibly passed his mantle to the man Rhett would come to hate most, Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, who had war hero status from the Mexican War. One of the first two senators from California was William Gwin, Andrew Jackson's old crony from Isaac Franklin's hometown of Gallatin, Tennessee. Gwin, who owned 200 or so slaves, was an embodiment of the slave power. You see, after becoming a congressman from Mississippi, he wrote Jackson on March 14th, 1842, saying, "I want a slaveholder for president next time, regardless of the man believing, as I solemnly do, that in the next presidential term, the abolitionists must be put down or blood will be spilt." Relocated to San Francisco, he participated in California's 1849 Constitutional Convention, where presumably understanding that the free soil measure would pass, he acceded to it graciously. Though he failed in his quest to bring slavery to the state, he was a happy man. He was the first slave baron to become a gold baron, having brought a mine that struck it rich. He organized the pro slavery Democratic political faction of the California legislature, the so called Chivalry Ring, informally known as the Chivs. Gwen's case was not so typical. Slavery wasn't in control of the gold mines, and as the world's economy was transformed by the new money, the species failed to go south. Ultimately, the California gold strike was the death knell for an archaic modality of agrarian capitalism. But the South had no way out. It was locked into holding its wealth in the form of slaves with human fecundity. Still, the road to monetary increase while slavery was locked out of the gold rush. Enormous tracts of land were coming on the market as East Texas cotton fields bloomed under the hands of trafficked enslaved laborers. Amid a generally inflationary environment, the price of slaves went up, up, up. But the largest movement of slaves, South and West, had already been completed. Both Texas and Arkansas were viable new markets, but Mississippi was already reaching its saturation point. South Carolina's overfarmed cotton land was playing out. Planters migrated westward, a little at a time, drawn by the lure of cheap land and a better deal. By 1850, more than 50,000 South Carolina natives lived in Georgia, writes Lacey K. Ford. More than 45,000 lived in Alabama, and some 26,000 lived in Mississippi. The cultural swath they cut as they brought laborers from the most Africanized population of North America remains a permanent part of American culture. South Carolinian politicians have been actively constructing an ideology for succession since the 1820s, if not all along, one that cast the Constitution as an instrument of oppression now that its original meaning had been perverted by abolitionists. By 1850, they were working to export the secession project to the rest of the South. More of the state's land was under cultivation by slave labor, and more of its politicians were apt to favor secession. Most of South Carolina was covered by plantations, with only a few counties in the north of the state not primarily slave driven. In the plantation counties, nearly all of the white population's prosperity depended, one way or another, on the continuance, which meant the exportation of slavery. South Carolina, so heavily dependent upon slave property, had the most concentrated core of support for secession, arguably followed in zeal by the state of Mississippi. In Maryland, only a minority were in favor of secession, though they were vocal, but slavery in Maryland was on the decline. Much of Maryland did not rely on slave labor. Between manumission and the sale of slaves down south, its enslaved population was actually decreasing. As Bancroft put it, counting slave property as so much interest producing capital, Maryland's course, viewed superficially, was spendthrift, for it was steadily eating into the principal. The enslaved of Maryland had the most chance to escape via the Underground Railroad. All they had to do was get across the border to Pennsylvania, then push on to Canada. From Baltimore, they might have a chance at slipping away on a boat, the way Frederick Douglass did. While the number of escapees via the Underground Railroad may have been statistically small, the existence of a path to freedom was psychologically significant. The South was a prison, but the enslaved knew that there was an escape to the north. With the West Coast becoming free soil, Southerners were desperate for an outlet to the Pacific. As the great debate over the new Western territories continued, Congress mulled the possibility of admitting a state of desert, ultimately admitting it as Utah. And there was talk of war as slave soiled Texas attempted to annex new free soil, New Mexico. The march of slavery had been halted at Texas. California was a free state. Now, the South's greatest obsession was its old dream of taking Cuba. A Cuban state in the Union would have two reliably pro slavery senators. There was no way to make Cuba a free state. Its slaves were creating too much wealth, and annexing Cuba would have dramatically boosted the values of extant North American slaveholding, which is to say, the slave breeding industry. The United States would not only annex Cuba, but its enormous slave trade, which was part of the United States, which could no longer be supplied with Africans, but it would have to buy slaves entirely from US sources, because if Cuba was a part of the United States, they would have to agree to that amendment that said the importation of African slaves was illegal after so and so a date. And so that's why this would be a boom for the slave breeding industry. Alone would not be able to supply such a demand. Narcisco Lopez, a Venezuelan adventurer, briefly invaded Cuba in 1848, hoping to annex it to the United States as a slave state. With the backing of secessionist Mississippi Governor John Quitman, who hoped to make Mississippi into a slave breeding state for Cuba's market right across the Gulf, and with a cheering section that included John L. O'Sullivan, the New Orleans Delta, and the New York Sun, Lopez invaded Cuba a second time. He organized his venture at the same jumping off point as Austin, Texas invasion, Banks Arcade in New Orleans. The one star flag he flew, based on the Lone Star flag of Texas, first flew on Fulton and Nassau Streets in New York, above the offices of the Sun. It was later adapted to become the flag of Cuba with the colors reversed, Puerto Rico. Landing at the northern part of Cuba in the port of Cardenas, with some 600 men in May of 1850, Lopez found Cuba more difficult than he had imagined. Nor did he learn until he had safely escaped back to New Orleans that a number of Cuban slaves had stowed away in his boats, hoping to escape the plantation. They were returned to Cuba. Lopez faced indictment for violation of the Neutrality Act, and Quitman was ultimately forced to resign his post as governor, but not before he had a city in Mississippi named after him. Quitman, Mississippi. Lopez invaded Cuba a third time in 1851. He was captured and publicly garroted in Havana using a screw turn device that crushed his windpipe as he sat in a chair. In the wake of Lopez's failure, a secret society of Cuban exiles and Southern rights supporters was formed in the United States to further the work of annexing Cuba and of the expansion of slave territory in general. The Order of the Lone Star, or OLS, Founded in Lafayette, Louisiana, with Pierre Soule as its first president, the organization came to claim, almost certainly hyperbolically, some 15,000 members in 10 states, with its greatest strength in the Alabama Texas corridor. In response to the controversy over the Compromise of 1850 and the growing out of a previous call by the late John C. Calhoun, Mississippi politicians announced a convention to be held at Nashville beginning June 1st of 1850. So they met, they discussed, they had plans. These are the things that they did. They strategized and executed. South Carolina was the only state to send a full delegation of 4 to the Southern Convention, also known as the Nashville Convention, ostensibly held to discuss ways to preserve the Union. It was promoted by the South Carolinians to legitimize the idea of secession and not incidentally to position themselves as the leaders of the movement. Only 9 of the 15 slaveholding states sent delegates. Most of those who attended were Tennessee locals. We know what the room smelled like. The church where the convention was held had to replace its carpet afterwards because of all the tobacco juice and cigar ash. We know that the delegates were entertained by a troupe of Swiss bell ringers. The Nashville True Whig and Weekly Commercial Register noted that in St. George L. Sissoin's paraphrase, there was a noticeable identity and personnel between the Southern advocates of the Nashville Convention and the promoters of the expedition of George Lopez for the conquest of Cuba, most notably Governor Quitman. The refusal to admit Cuba as an independent Southern state into the Union, said the newspaper, is another alternative, vaguely hinted at by Mr. Calhoun, to which disunion would be preferred by the extreme Southern factionists. Held in the city that was in the heart of Jacksonism, the Nashville Convention drove another wedge into the crevice between secessionists and Jacksonian Unionists. In a letter to James Buchanan, the late President Polk's close Tennessee ally, Cave Johnson, wrote, "Be not surprised if you should hear even me with my 50 or 60 Negroes denounced for favoring the abolitionists, because I will not yield to the mad projects of disunion that are now so freely talked of." The lesson we need to remember and keep at the forefront of our minds is that abolitionists were not abolitionists. Most abolitionists were unionists. And if we can remember that they wanted to preserve the union and power of the United States, they didn't give a doggone about slavery, then we will be better for it and we will stop lionizing and making heroes out of people in history that should not be lionized or made heroes. They just simply weren't as bad as the actual villains. Rhett's aggressive political strategy was much like South Carolina's take the most extreme position and fight from there. He was disappointed by the lack of succession fever from the other states, whose more moderate members, including Unionist Sam Houston, carried the day. Only the South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia delegates, the states with the highest concentrations of slave labor, have been strongly in favor of succession, but more significant than the results was that the delegates from southern states had convened to talk about remaining in the Union, which is to say, to talk about secession. So they knew they didn't even have the numbers or the support. They didn't have the numbers or the support to actually support this secessionist thing that they were talking about. Think about it. If most of the people at this Southern Convention were talking about we need to preserve the Union, what can we do to preserve the Union? I own slaves, but I still am in favor of the Union or the united combined power that we can wield on a global scale versus my small financial interests. We need to preserve the Union. Louisiana did not send delegates to the Nashville Convention, but the excitable French-born Louisiana Senator Pierre Soule proposed to the Senate on June 24th the extension of the Missouri Compromise line out to the West Coast, as the convention had recommended. Soule wanted to divide California into two states, with the southern slaveholding one to be called South California. Sorry about that. Brandishing the by now standard threat of disunion, he warned that to not leave South California open to slavery would be, he must have shouted it, because it was printed in all caps in the Congressional Globe, to exclude the South forever from a share in all the territories throughout spoliations of her rights and degradation of her sovereignty, without an alternative that does not end in an inglorious submission or a rapture of the Union. As the California debate dragged on, President Zachary Taylor became the second Whig war hero president to die in office, succumbing suddenly from cholera on July 9th, 1850, leaving behind an estate of 131 slaves to be divided among his three children by his lawyer, Judah P. Benjamin. As the nation lauded him, the Charleston Mercury was spiteful. Taylor was succeeded by Vice President Millard Fillmore, who cleaned house and brought in his own cabinet. Fillmore, who was from Buffalo, New York, and had been moderately anti-slavery as a congressman, who voted against the annexation of Texas. But President Fillmore refused to submit to the Mexico Constitution to Congress because it would have brought in another free soil state and thus would have disturbed the balance in the Senate. What is there in New Mexico that could be, by any possibility, induce anybody to go there with slaves? Asked Daniel Webster in Congress. Who expects to see 100 Black men cultivating tobacco, corn, rice, or anything else on lands in New Mexico made fertile only by irrigation? Texas's motive for trying to take a big chunk of New Mexico may have only been hostage taking. The Republic of Texas had run up heavy debt selling bonds that the state of Texas could not pay. Though Fillmore stood up to Texas's attempted annexation of New Mexico, threatening to send troops, Texas got a bailout from its debts as ransom. Fillmore signed the compromise into law, and California became a state on September 9th, 1850, which is why Fillmore's name survived in San Francisco to become the name of a rock concert palace in the 1860s. Another of the city's main thoroughfares is named after Pope. But signing the compromise into law meant signing the Fugitive Slave Act, which cost Fillmore much support in the North and likely the election in 1852, which he lost. Slavery had lost the contest for Western expansion. But if the intense polemic from Calhoun and his successors had done nothing else, it had made leaving the Union unthinkable in the South. And whatever the specific political issue being fought over, it was all about slavery. Increasing numbers of people in the slave states have severed the emotional attachment with a country that could harbor unprosecuted abolitionists. The nation's churches had largely split into Northern and Southern over slavery. Slave owners wanted Cuba badly, and the secessionists imagined that they were sure to have Mexico, Central America, all the way down. When a second session of the Nashville Convention was called for November, the moderates stayed home. And on November 14th, 1850, the delegates heard the 73-year-old veteran South Carolina politician Langdon Cheves deliver an oration that presented the case for immediate succession in fiery terms. If 4 states would do it. Since 3 were already in the bag, he was trying to convert just one of the attending delegations. The South was not a particularly hospitable place for any Yankee, but for a Northern reporter, deep cover was especially necessary. Joseph Holt Ingram, a Maine-born Episcopal clergyman who had discreetly published his letters under the name Kate Cunningham, saw Cheves as a hale, white-headed old gentleman with fine port wine tint to his florid cheek. Cheves denounced abolitionists and communists, a term recently current from its use during the European Revolutionary War in the year of 1848 in Marxist Communist Manifesto, and which would carry radicalized connotations in Southern rhetoric into the Jim Crow era, when the Communist Party was the only one to call for full racial equality. Cheves conflated communism with democracy, as well as Jacobinism with anarchy. He denounced them all as equivalent to abolitionism, which he then dismissed as the minstrelic metaphor that referenced the old practice of blacking up one's face before engaging in group attacks. He said, "What we call the rights of man or the admission of great masses to the power of self-government has brought into action the minds of persons utterly unqualified to judge of the subject practically, who have generated the wildest theories. This agitation has recently reached the United States. It has been introduced by European agents and has brought under its delusions the subject of African slavery in the southern states. It is of the family of communism. It is the doctrine of the anarchists. Proud Han that property is a crime. It is the same doctrine. They have blackened its face to disguise it." Sliding into his big finish, Cheves called for Southern unity by evoking a master race utopia, saying, "Unite, and your slave property shall be protected to the very border of the Mason-Dixon line. Unite, and the free soilers shall at their peril be your police to prevent the escape of your slaves. California shall be a slave state. The dismembered territory of Texas shall be restored, and you shall enjoy a full participation in all the territory which was conquered by your blood and treasure. Unite, and you shall form one of the most splendid empires on which the sun has ever shone, of the most homogeneous population, all of the same blood and lineage. That sounds like an incestuous cry, doesn't it? Sheaves' speech was no fluke. Pro slavery writers formulated the first generation of America anti communist rhetoric. Southern ideology had coalesced into a vision of a worthy elite who governs while the unworthy multitude suffer, with South Carolina taking the philosophical lead. Though the turnout at the second Nashville convention was disappointing, Rhett followed up by developing a plan with Whitman to call a secession Congress in 1852. And on May 7th of that year, Rhett abruptly resigned the Senate seat he had recently returned to, taking full control of the Charleston Mercury, the fire eaters eating as newspaper in the entire South. He installed his son, Robert Barnwell Rhett Jr., as editor. People are being convicted of abolitionism in South Carolina courts, though it was early yet in the building curve of hysteria, which took 9 more years to become cannon fire. It was not safe to voice even moderate anti slavery views. The pro secessionist British consul Robert Bunch wrote, persons are torn away from their residences, and pursuits, sometimes tarred and feathered, ridden upon rails or cruelly whipped. Letters are opened at the post offices. Discussion upon slavery is entirely prohibited under penalty of expulsion with or without violence from the country. The Whig Party barely outlived Henry Clay. It was divided into sectional wings, and by 1852, it was disintegrating. Former Whigs and anti slavery Jacksonians met in the new Republican Party, which did not exist in the South. The South Carolina writer, editor, statistician James Dunsworthy Brownson DeBow began publishing his DeBow's Review in New Orleans in 1846, a deluxe business news publication with articles on scientific agricultural management and new developments in technology. It was a voice of the modernizing wing of the pro slavery movement. Perpetually in financial straits because its subscribers tended to not pay up, the composition and printing of the magazine was done in the North, where the cost was a third of what it would have been in the South, and the better quality. During the Pierce presidency, DeBow was placed in charge of the 7th census of 1850, the most detailed U.S. census up to that time. As the 1850s passed, the review's pro slavery, pro secession positions became even more extreme, as it looked more toward industrial, technocratic, slave driven South. By the 1850s, in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act, the anti slavery movement was making itself felt in the popular arts. Harriet Beecher Stowe had published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, a best selling book that reached even more people in its numerous unauthorized stage adaptations. William Wells Brown, previously the author of the narrative of William W. Brown, a fugitive slave, written in 1847, became the first African American to publish a novel, though it could not be published in the United States at the time. Clotel, or the President's Daughter, was about a fictional slave children descended from Thomas Jefferson who was named in the book. Brown at the time was a fugitive from slavery, or rather, from the Fugitive Slave Act. He had fled the United States for London, where the novel was published. He published other versions of it later, including a 1864 American edition that changed the fictional protagonist's parentage from Jefferson to being the granddaughter of an American senator. Slave narratives became an established publishing genre. Solomon Northup, one of the few kidnapped free people to have descended into slavery and then been rescued, returned to his life in Saratoga, New York, and told his story in 12 Years a Slave, written in 1853, dedicated to Harriet Beecher Stowe. John Thompson, a literate slave who escaped Maryland via the Underground Railroad and became a whaler in New England and a stern Methodist preacher, self-published his autobiography in Massachusetts in 1856, named The Life of John Thompson, a Fugitive Slave, containing his history of 25 years in bondage and his providential escape, written by himself. To out himself as a fugitive slave was a provocation in 1856, when lawmen anywhere in the United States were obligated to hand accused slaves over without further proceedings. It was a public dare. Here I am. Come and get me. Sentimental popular songs referred to the intense slave trade in response to Stowe's book. Stephen Foster's My Old Country Home, premiered in 1853 by Christy Minstrels, was at first titled Poor Uncle Tom, Good Night, before Foster rewrote it. It's now the state song of Kentucky, but they don't sing the third verse anymore, which says, the head must bow and the back will have to bend wherever the darky may go. A few more days and the trouble will end in the field where the sugar cane grow. A few more days for to tote the weary land, the weary load, no matter 'twill never be light. A few more days till we trotter on the road, then my old country Kentucky home, good night. That's a song about a black man from Kentucky being worked to death in a sugar prison camp in Louisiana. Benjamin Hamby's tear-jerking My Darling Nellie Gray, written in 1856, which Hamby based on a story told him as a child by a black man named Joseph Selby, sang of an enslaved couple broken apart by a sale of a woman to Georgia. Oh, my poor Nellie Gray, they have taken you away, and I'll never see my darling anymore. I'm sitting by the river and I'm weeping all the day, for you're gone from the old Kentucky shore. This genre of songs continued after the Civil War. Things like James Bland, Carry Me Back to My Old Virginny, when they were bowlerized and bizarrely repurposed into the nostalgia for the Old South. Anthony Burns, a self-emancipated 20-year-old man who had escaped from Virginia via the Underground Railroad, was apprehended in Boston on May 24, 1854, by a U.S. commissioner acting on the behest of a slave catcher hired by Burns' former slave master. His case became a cause célèbre. One man was killed when a mob unsuccessfully tried to storm the courthouse to free him, but he was extradited to Richmond, where he was put into isolation at Lumpkin's slave jail. The Boston journalist Charles Emery Stevens published a book about the case, which described the conditions under which Burns was held for 4 months. This place of his confinement was a room only 6 or 8 feet square in the upper story of the jail, which was accessible only through a trap door. He was allowed neither bed nor air. A rude bench was fastened against the wall, and a single coarse blanket were the only means of repose. After entering his cell, the handcuffs were not removed, but in addition, fetters were placed upon his feet. In his manacled condition, he was kept during the greater part of his confinement. The torture which he suffered in consequence was excruciating. The the grip of the irons impeded the circulation of his blood, made hot and rapid by the stifling atmosphere, and caused his feet to swell enormously. The flesh was worn at his wrists, and when the wounds had healed, there remained broad scars as perpetual witness against his owner. The fetters also prevented him from removing his clothing by day or night, and no one came to help him. The indecency resulting from such a condition is too revolting for a description or even thought. His room became more foul and noisome than the hovel of a brute. Loathsome creeping things multiplied and rioted in the filth. His food consisted of a piece of coarse cornbread and the parings of bacon or putrid meat. This fare supplied him once a day. He was compelled to devour without plate, knife, or fork. Immured as he was in a narrow, unventilated room beneath the heated roof of the jail, a constant supply of fresh water would have been a heavenly boon. But the only means of quenching his thirst was the nauseating contents of a pail that was replenished only once or twice a week. Living under such an accumulation of atrocities, at length he fell seriously ill. This brought about some mitigation of his treatment. His fetters were removed for a time, and he was supplied with broth, which, compared with his previous food, was a luxury in and of itself. One day, his attention was attracted by a noise in the room beneath him. There was a sound as of a woman entreating and sobbing, and of a man addressing her commands mingled with oaths. Looking down through the crevice of the floor, Burns beheld a slave woman, stark naked, in the presence of 2 men. One of them was an overseer, and the other a person who had come to purchase a slave. The overseer compelled the woman to disrobe in order that the purchaser might see for himself whether she was well formed and sound of body. Burns was horror stricken. All his previous experience had not made him aware of such an outrage. This, however, was not an exceptional case. He found it was the ordinary custom in Lumpkin's jail, thus to expose the naked person of the slave to both male and female to the inspection of the purchaser. A wider range of observation would have enabled him to see that it was the universal custom of the slave states. After a while, he found a friend in the family of Lumpkin. The wife of this man was a yellow woman, whom he had married as much from necessity as from choice. The white women of the South refusing to connect themselves with professed slave traders. This woman manifested her compassion for Burns by giving him a testament and a hymn book. Upon most slaves, these gifts would have been thrown away. But fortunately for Burns, he had learned to read, and the books proved a very treasure. Besides the yellow wife, Lumpkin had a black concubine, and she also manifested a friendly spirit toward the prisoner. The house of Lumpkin was separated from the jail only by the yard, and from one of the upper windows, the girl contrived to hold conversations with Anthony, whose apartment was directly opposite. Her compassion, it was not unlikely, changed into a warmer feeling she discovered one day by her lord and master. What he overheard roused his jealousy, and he took effectual means to break off the intercourse. Burns was sold at auction after 4 months to a planter, but his freedom was subsequently purchased by L.M. Grimes, a minister who had established a church for runaway slaves in Boston. Fugitive slaves had become pop culture by this point. According to Stevens, P.T. Barnum offered the newly freed Burns $500 to be an exhibit in his museum in New York, but Burns indignantly turned it down, reportedly saying, "He wants to show me like a monkey." N.B. Forrest, dealer of slaves, number 87 Adams Street, has just received from South Carolina 25 likely young Negroes to which he desires to call the attention of purchasers. He will be in the regular receipt of Negroes from North and South Carolina every month. His Negro depot is one of the most complete and commodious establishments of the kind in the southern country, and regulations, exact and systematic cleanliness, neatness, and comfort being strictly observed and enforced. And his aim is to furnish to customers number one servants and field hands, sound and perfect in body and mind, Negroes taken on commission. The and Inquirer, June 2nd, 1857. The Western Tennessee River port of Memphis was a jump off point for selling slaves into the new territories of Arkansas and Texas. Memphis was a mature slave market by 1852, when the 30-year-old slave trader Nathan Bedford Forrest, yes, that Nathan Bedford Forrest, begins to appear in the city's records. The hot-headed Forrest was at least as rash a man as Jackson, but had even less education. He instilled fear in those around him, and he didn't stay business partners with anyone very long. For a year, he worked in partnership called Forrest and Jones. Then, with the more established Bird Hill, he co-founded Hill and Forrest. And by 1855, was partners with Josiah Maples in Forrest and Maples. He brought a double lot on Adams Street, named for John Adams, between Washington and Jefferson Streets, using 85 Adams for his house and 87 Adams for his jail. And soon he began to run the customary 500 Negroes Wanted advertisements in the paper. While opening depots in other towns, he seemed to have procured his merchandise in what had become the standard way, canvassing planters personally and via agents, buying people one at a time. It was no longer necessary to go to the eastern shore of Maryland to find farmers willing to sell slaves. These were the high priced years of the slave trade, and profits came fast. In a mythologizing account written at the time of Forrest's funeral in 1877, Lafcadio Hearn, who was passing through Memphis at the time, wrote, that Forrest was reported to have been kind to his slaves, yet to have taught them to fear him exceedingly. White people were afraid of him too. He did not hesitate to escalate to lethal action, as when he put a gun to a tailor's head for having delivered a bad suit. He made a lot of money in the slave business, some of which he invested in land before winding it down in 1860 and getting out of the business by 1861. Other traders continued in the business after the South succeeded, but Forrest, he went to war, which allowed him to further develop the talent for blunt violence that had served him so well in slave trading. Well, that's the end of our reading for today. What do you think? Do you think that all of these characters from the past were problematic people? I think that they were. I think that the lesson we need to learn is that we don't have any historical friends. We have periodic strategic alliances. We need to stop thinking that anyone is coming to save us but ourselves. We freed ourselves. We were the ones that ran away to freedom. We were the ones that stood toe to toe with them. We were the ones that were the arbiters of our own freedom. Don't let anybody tell you any different. These kind words written by men of the past, these men were unionists. They were not abolitionists. And they have intertwined those two words so that we don't know the difference. And we began to think that white people are our friend when they are not. Remember that this show is a part of a podcasting network called KWAZ Radio. There are hosts like the Bitter Medicine Podcast, the Pro Black Perspective, the Forecast Radio, Casidra Cheek, Brother Bakari, and Kofi the Black Critic. I'd like to thank Bawana Haguziki, the Forecast Radio, Sister Raw, and the elders listening with her, Oni Tase, Koku, Kofi, Brother Bakari, Dorico Cooper, Flubbery Fish 97, Joe Boxer, and Arbiter 467. And you, yes, you. Thank you for hanging with me this long. I appreciate you for being here. I will be back next time and we will continue our reading of the American Slave Coast. We locked in and almost done. We only have a few chapters left, and then we'll move on to our next two books. Thank you so much for tuning in. Peace, guys.